She watched his hands that evening and could not stop watching them. These were the same hands she had only ever seen gliding over an iPad, approving contracts worth millions. Now they were scratched and dirt-dark, methodically stripping bark from a branch, coaxing fire from friction and wood with a patience she'd never imagined him capable of. "How do you know how to do that?" she asked, before she could stop herself. He didn't look up. "My father," he said quietly, the words carrying weight she couldn't yet understand. "He believed a man should know how to survive with nothing but what the world gives him." A wisp of smoke curled upward. Sebastian leaned in, cupped his hands around the ember, and blew, gentle, almost tender, as if he were protecting something fragile and precious. A flame flickered to life. He stared at it for a long moment, and Aya saw the tension in his shoulders ease, just slightly, a man who had brought light back into darkness. That night, the temperature dropped like a stone. Aya huddled by the fire, her arms wrapped around herself, refusing to complain, refusing to show weakness, even as her teeth chattered and her body shook. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Without a word, Sebastian stood up, took off his torn suit jacket, his last remaining layer, and held it out to her. "No," she said immediately. "You'll freeze. I'm warmer than you are." Sebastian. Aya. Just her name. Firm. Certain. And underneath it, something that sounded almost like please. She looked up at him. At the genuine, unguarded concern carved into the face she had spent 2 years reading as cold. And something inside her shifted. Something tectonic. Something that could not be shifted back. She took the jacket. It was still warm from his body. It smelled like smoke, and pine, and something indefinably him. She pulled it over her shoulders and it felt, absurdly, like a shield. He returned to his side of the fire and sat with his arms folded against the cold, rubbing warmth into his own skin. Aya watched him, and felt a knot of something complicated tighten in her chest. She couldn't sleep. She watched the fire and she watched Sebastian, and she noticed, in the dancing light, the small tremors running through his body. He was cold. He was hiding it. He was doing it for her. Before she could think better of it, she was on her feet. She walked around the fire and sat down beside him. Pressed her shoulder against his. Draped the jacket across them both like a makeshift blanket. "What are you doing?" His voice was thick with exhaustion, his eyes still closed. "Sharing." Silence. Then, so slowly it was barely perceptible, he leaned into her. A surrender so quiet it could have been missed. Aya's heart hammered against her ribs. She had built 2 years of professional life around one certainty: she despised Sebastian Ashbourne. It was solid. Reliable. Safe. But the man shivering beside her, the man who had given her his last layer of warmth, she didn't know him at all. And as she sat under an unfamiliar canopy of stars, sharing a jacket and a sliver of warmth with a man she thought she hated, a thought bloomed in the darkness. Terrifying. Undeniable. She wasn't sure she hated him anymore. She woke to the smell of roasting fish and birdsong. Sebastian was crouched by a small stream, turning 2 silver fish over a fire he'd somehow coaxed back from the night's dying embers. When he heard her stir, he glanced over his shoulder, and Aya saw something she would have declared impossible 24 hours ago. He was almost smiling. Not the sharp, predatory corporate smile. This was something small and hesitant, barely there, but real. It reached his eyes in a way she'd never witnessed before. "You caught fish," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Improvisation," he said simply, and handed her a stick with a perfectly crisped fish on the end. They fell into a rhythm after that, wordless, instinctive, surprisingly natural. Sebastian secured the camp, explored for an exit route, engineered solutions from wreckage and forest. Aya discovered that her grandmother's lifelong lessons in botany were worth more than any survival manual. she identified edible roots, found leaves with antiseptic properties, wove broad waxy fronds to waterproof their shelter. They weren't boss and employee anymore. They were something forged by necessity. Something neither of them had a word for yet. One afternoon, while she carefully cleaned the wound on his forehead, now angry and inflamed, she found herself closer to him than she had ever been. Close enough to see the faint scar above his eyebrow. Close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Her fingers were gentle against his face, and when they finished, her thumb lingered, just a fraction of a second too long, against his temple. His breath hitched. Their eyes met. The air between them turned electric. She pulled her hand back quickly and stepped away. But the current didn't fade. That same evening, the forest went utterly, unnaturally silent. "Listen," Sebastian said sharply, his body going rigid. She listened. And understood immediately, the birds, the rustling, the small sounds of living things, all of it, gone. The forest was holding its breath. They found the tracks by the stream. Enormous. Deep-clawed. Unmistakably feline. That night, the panther came. 2 yellow eyes materialized from the darkness beyond their fire, gleaming, calculating, patient. Sebastian placed himself between Aya and those eyes without hesitation. One deliberate step forward. The makeshift spear raised. "If I tell you to run," he said, his voice barely a whisper but absolute as iron, "you run. I'm not leaving you." He turned his head slightly. "Promise me." But before she could answer, the panther stepped into the firelight, and Sebastian moved. He lunged for the fire, seized a burning branch, and hurled it into the darkness before the cat in a shower of sparks. Then another. Then another, building a wall of fire with fluid, fearless precision. His voice tore through the forest in a raw, primal roar that seemed to shake the trees themselves. The panther recoiled. Paced. Snarled with fury. And then, with a final lash of its tail, vanished. Aya realized she hadn't breathed in 30 seconds. Sebastian did not sleep that night. He stood sentinel until dawn, feeding the fire, scanning the dark, protecting her while she finally surrendered to exhaustion. When she woke with the first gray light and saw him still there, still standing, still holding the line for her, something in her chest cracked open. "You didn't sleep," she said, her voice breaking. "Couldn't risk it. You need to rest. I'll keep watch." He looked at her, this woman he had dismissed for 2 years, and she watched the war in his eyes. Pride against necessity. Control against trust. Finally, he lay down. But he couldn't sleep. His body was wound too tight, his mind unable to release. Without thinking, without allowing herself the space to reconsider, Aya sat beside him and took his hand. Sebastian went absolutely still. "I'm right here," she said softly. "Nothing is going to happen." He stared at their joined hands. Then, so slowly it was almost invisible, his fingers curled through hers. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered. She thought about it honestly. And gave him the truest answer she had. "Because you would do the same for me." Something softened in his face, something old and armored and exhausted finally letting go. His eyes drifted closed. And with her hand holding his, Sebastian Ashbourne finally slept. Cloud with lightning and rain, confession in the rain. The sky broke that evening without warning. A violent, hammering deluge that punished the forest canopy and drove cold water through every gap in their shelter. The fire died with a defeated hiss. Darkness closed in. "We have to stay warm," Sebastian said tightly. "Hypothermia is a real risk." He pulled her into the driest corner, his back to the wind, his arms around her, pulling her close against his chest. She didn't resist. Her body was shaking too hard to perform dignity. And in the roaring darkness, cocooned together against the storm, Sebastian began to talk. My parents died when I was 15, he said. His voice was steady. Deliberate. Like a man finally setting down something very heavy. Car accident. My uncle took me in. Took over the company too. Aya listened without moving. She could feel the vibration of his words through his chest. He told me I had to be strong. That the world was full of predators. That if I showed any weakness, they'd tear me apart. So I learned. I learned to build walls. To treat everything like a transaction. To never let anyone see that something, or someone, mattered. His arms tightened around her. Back at the office, you always looked at me like I was a monster. Aya's throat tightened. And you were right, he said, before she could speak. His voice raw with self-loathing. Sebastian. I was. He lifted his hand, his cold fingers finding her cheek in the darkness. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a gesture so gentle it broke her. But here. I can't pretend anymore. And the truth is, I hate the man I became. I just don't know how to be anyone else. Aya covered his hand with both of hers and pressed it against her face. Maybe you don't have to learn, she whispered. Maybe you just have to remember. The person you were before your uncle told you who to be. The person who stood between me and a panther. The person who stayed up all night in the cold so I could sleep. That is the real you, Sebastian. Not the machine in the suit. He stared down at her in the darkness. Searching. Uncertain. Hungry for something he'd been told he wasn't allowed to want. Aya took a breath and gave him the rest of what was true. I hated you, she confessed. Back in that life, I hated you so much. You were cold and dismissive and you never once said thank you. I thought you were empty. She lifted her hands to frame his face, making him look at her. But you're not. You're here. You've kept me alive. You've protected me. Taught me. And I don't know what to feel anymore because everything I thought I knew about you was wrong. You are, she struggled for the word that was large enough. You are extraordinary. His breath caught. Aya. If I kiss you now, he said, his voice a raw, desperate rasp, there's no going back. I won't be able to pretend it didn't happen. Her heart thundered. Then don't pretend, she whispered. And Sebastian broke. He kissed her the way a man kisses someone when he has forgotten what it feels like to be human, with desperation, with tenderness, with the raw, consuming relief of a person who has finally stopped running. It tasted of rain and survival and every word they had never found the courage to say. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, he held her against his chest like she was the only solid thing left in a world that had already ended once. I don't want to be that man anymore, he murmured into her hair, his voice a vow made to the storm. For the first time in my life. I want to choose. They woke to a washed, glistening world. Everything had shifted, the air between them, their movements, the way his hand found hers naturally as they planned their escape. The highest peak in the distance was their target. A signal fire. A real chance. Together, Sebastian said, when she asked if they could make it. Just that word. But it was a promise. The climb began gently enough. Then the forest thickened, darkened, grew watchful. And then Aya saw it, half buried in the moss. Yellowed. Cracked. Unmistakably human. A bone. Sebastian. His foot came down on something metallic. A sharp click. And the world flipped. A rope snare snapped tight around his ankle and yanked him violently into the air. He swung 3 meters from the ground, his cry of pain cutting through the trees. Aya, get out of here. Run. I'm not leaving you. Listen to me. His voice cracked with desperation. If they find us both, we have no chance. Hide. I swear I will come back for you. I promise. Then she heard it. Drums. Deep, rhythmic, growing closer with every frantic heartbeat. She ran for the nearest tree and pressed herself flat against the bark, her body shaking, her hands clamped over her mouth. Figures emerged from the forest, painted, masked, carrying stone-tipped spears. An uncontacted tribe, moving with the fluid certainty of people who had never feared anything in these woods. They surrounded Sebastian, cut the rope, and bound his hands and feet with practiced efficiency. As they carried him away, Sebastian turned his head. His eyes searched the tree line desperately, until they found her. His expression wasn't fear. It was a silent, furious, pleading command. Survive. Leopard the huntress. She almost didn't move. She stayed pressed against that tree until the drumming faded, until the birds began returning, until the forest went back to pretending nothing had happened. Her lungs were burning. Her mind was white static terror. Then another image cut through the panic. Sebastian, standing between her and the panther. Sebastian, awake all night so she could sleep. Sebastian, kissing her in the rain like being alive was a gift he was only just learning to receive. A fierce, hot, protective rage ignited in her chest. She pushed off the tree. Her legs were shaking but they moved. Her hands were trembling but they reached. I'm coming for you. She tracked the tribe to their settlement, a sprawling village of thatched structures, smoke from a dozen fires, the low hum of communal life. And at the center, tied to a wooden stake driven into the earth, was Sebastian. Alive. Battered. Still searching the tree line with his eyes. Still holding out hope. Aya watched for hours. Studied the guards' patterns. Mapped the blind spots. And deep in the archive of her memory, a fragment surfaced from a college anthropology class: isolated tribes. Primal fears. The Black Panther, not an animal, but a spirit. A vengeful ghost of the slain. She had no way of knowing if this tribe believed that. But it was the only card she had. She circled back toward the stream to find the panther, or, more accurately, to let the panther find her. She was gathering river stones when she felt it. The heaviness in the air. The prickling at the back of her neck. She turned slowly. The panther was watching her from the edge of the trees. Massive. Silent. Those amber eyes, calm and ancient and utterly without mercy. Aya Morin, graphic designer, survivor, the woman who had once been invisible in a corporate office, stood her ground. She thought of Sebastian's face. She thought of the fire he'd coaxed from nothing. She thought of his hand, lacing through hers. And she began, carefully, deliberately, to move toward the village, trusting the panther to follow the thing it had already decided to track. The plan was insane. It was reckless. It was exactly the kind of thing the old Aya, the one who hunched her shoulders and tried to take up as little space as possible, never would have dared. But that woman had been left in the wreckage of a plane somewhere in these mountains. This Aya was someone else entirely. The panther's appearance at the village edge sent the settlement into chaos, exactly as she'd prayed it would. Firebrands were seized, voices rose, guards scattered from their posts. And in those precious, terrifying minutes of pandemonium, Aya ran. She cut Sebastian's bonds with the shard of metal she'd carried since the first day. His eyes flew open when he felt her hands. I told you to hide, he breathed. I know, she said. Run. They ran. Through the forest, back up the mountain, lungs burning and legs screaming, until the trees thinned and the peak opened before them and the sky was enormous and blue and full of possibility. Sebastian built the signal fire with shaking hands, and Aya fed it, and together they stood in the smoke and the light and the wind, and they waited. The helicopter found them on the 4th hour. As the sound of rotors split the sky, Sebastian turned to her. His face was cut, bruised, shadowed with exhaustion. His suit was destroyed. He looked nothing like the CEO she had worked beside for 2 years. He looked real. He took her hand, not like he was steadying her, not because survival demanded it, but simply because he wanted to. "When we get back," he said quietly, "I want to be different." "You already are," she told him. "I want to be different with you," he said. And his gray eyes were steady and certain and warm in a way she had never once imagined they could be. "If you'll let me." Aya looked at this man, the cold glacier, the corporate predator, the stranger she thought she knew, and she felt the last stone of her armor quietly dissolve. "I'll let you," she said. And when the helicopter landed in the meadow of light, they walked toward it together. Herb life lesson, what this story teaches us. Before you leave, hear this, because the wilderness didn't just teach Aya and Sebastian to survive. It taught them something far more important. We build walls to protect ourselves from pain. But those same walls imprison us. Sebastian had spent 15 years becoming someone his grief had demanded, hard, transactional, unreachable. And Aya had spent 2 years reducing herself to invisible, hunching her shoulders, trying to take up as little space as possible. Both of them were surviving their lives instead of living them. It took a plane falling from the sky to strip them of their armor. And here is what the forest revealed underneath. A man who could build fire from nothing, who had never been allowed to show his warmth. A woman who could read the language of the natural world, who had never been seen as more than a supporting role. We spend enormous energy becoming who the world tells us to be. We forget, or were never shown, that the truest version of ourselves was never lost. It was just waiting. For a moment honest enough to call it forward. You don't need a plane crash to find that moment. You just need the courage to stop pretending. To let someone see the trembling in your hands. To give your warmth to someone who is cold, even when you're cold yourself. To say I was wrong about you, and mean it. The greatest survival skill isn't knowing how to build a fire. It's knowing how to let someone in. If this story moved you, if you felt even one moment that was true, then you already know what this channel is about. We don't just tell stories here. We tell the ones that stay with you. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Leave a comment below, tell us, what wall are you finally ready to let down? We'll see you in the next story. Red Heart. What if the one person you despised most in the world, became the only person standing between you and death? Not a rival. Not a stranger. Your boss. The man whose cold eyes made entire boardrooms go silent. The man who had never once, not once, said thank you to you in 2 years. What would it take for you to finally see him? What if it took a plane falling from the sky? Her name is Aya Morin, a graphic designer with a quiet storm inside her. She's the kind of woman who arrives early, works late, pours her soul into every project, and somehow remains invisible. She's brilliant. She's unbroken. And she has spent exactly 730 days professionally tolerating a man she is absolutely certain has no heart. His name is Sebastian Ashbourne, CEO of Ashbourne Industries. Tailored suits. Glacier eyes. A voice that could drop the temperature of any room by 5 degrees just by speaking. He doesn't smile. He doesn't thank. He doesn't feel, or at least, that's what the world believes. They are about to be alone together in the wilderness. And nothing will ever be the same. The turbulence began as a whisper. A gentle rhythmic shudder, the kind you dismiss with a sip of water and a deep breath. Aya kept her eyes on the glowing screen of her laptop, the half-finished design proposal casting a soft blue halo across her face. Around her, the private jet hummed with the ordinary sounds of expensive travel, recycled air, the clink of crystal, the barely audible shuffle of leather. She didn't need to look across the aisle to feel him. Sebastian Ashbourne occupied every room he entered, not with noise, but with presence. A silent gravitational force. The faint scent of expensive woodsy cologne and starched cotton seemed to announce him before he arrived and linger after he left. Right now, he was doing what he always did, reviewing documents, his expression carved from stone, his posture a masterclass in controlled indifference. Aya had long ago decided that Sebastian Ashbourne was not a man. He was a function. A corporate machine dressed in navy wool. Then the shudder changed. It wasn't rhythmic anymore. It was violent. A savage jolt slammed Aya against her seatbelt so hard the air burst from her lungs. Her laptop launched from her lap and cracked against the cabin floor. Before she could process what was happening, the plane dropped, not a dip, not a lurch, but a void, as if the sky itself had simply ceased to exist beneath them. Her stomach catapulted into her throat. A scream lodged itself in her chest, clawed and desperate, trapped behind teeth clenched so tight her jaw ached. She looked across the aisle. Sebastian's knuckles were white on the armrests. His jaw was a hard, furious line. But his eyes, his always calculating, always assessing gray eyes, they found hers across the chaos. And for one shattering heartbeat, the mask was gone. He was terrified. Just like her. Two strangers. One abyss. A shared, harrowing recognition of what was coming. Then the world exploded. Metal screamed. The cabin inverted. Overhead compartments burst open like wounded animals. Aya's world became a catastrophic blur of spinning green and blue, of alarms shrieking, of her own voice finally tearing free in a sound she didn't recognize as human. And then, blackness. Silence. The silence was the cruelest thing. Aya came back to consciousness the way you surface from a nightmare, gasping, disoriented, certain for one golden moment that none of it was real. Then the copper taste of blood hit her tongue. The sharp smell of jet fuel and crushed pine needles filled her lungs. A tree branch, massive, ancient, impossible, had speared through the fuselage inches from her head. She was alive. The realization didn't bring relief. It brought panic. She clawed at her seatbelt, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely grip the buckle. When it finally clicked open, the sound was a gunshot in the wreckage's eerie quiet. She pushed through the torn cabin, her ribs screaming, her legs tangling in wires and jagged metal, until she collapsed onto the cold, mossy forest floor. The trees rose around her like cathedral columns, towering, indifferent, ancient. The sky above was a broken mosaic of blue between shifting leaves. Then she heard it. A groan. Human. Close. She turned. Sebastian Ashbourne was slumped against the base of a massive oak tree. His impeccable navy suit, the armor he wore every single day, was torn at the shoulder. A gash on his forehead wept blood that traced a slow, red path down his jaw and dripped onto the dark earth. But it wasn't the blood that stopped her breath. It was his face. Stripped of power. Stripped of performance. He was simply a man, breathing hard, fighting to stay in the world, his eyes searching until they found hers. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a rough rasp, focused, urgent, human. Aya blinked. I don't think so." He tried to stand. His body betrayed him, and he swayed. Without thinking, before logic or professionalism or 2 years of carefully maintained professional distance could intervene, Aya scrambled to her feet and grabbed his arm. The fabric of his torn sleeve was rough under her fingers. His arm beneath it was solid as stone. It was the first time she had ever touched him. A current moved through her that she absolutely refused to examine. "Thank you," he murmured. Softer than she had ever heard him speak. They searched the wreckage together, calling names into the echoing silence. There was no answer. No movement. No one. Just the two of them. Alone. Stranded in an endless forest with no communication, no signal, no rescue, and nothing between them but 2 years of professional Cold War and the wreckage of a plane that had fallen from the sky. Sebastian turned to her. His face was battered, his suit destroyed, but his eyes burned with something that made her breath catch. "We are going to survive this," he said, his voice low and bedrock solid. "I promise you." And standing there in the wilderness, covered in ash and shaking with shock, Aya discovered something she hadn't expected. She believed him.